I'll tell you about that later. So, hello everybody. I'm Christine Blower, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this event discussing why socialists support the global Palestinian resistance. Today's forum is organised by Labour Outlook, which is a fast-growing website bringing daily news and views from across Labour's left and those at the forefront of resisting the Tories. Although this was called some months ago, and of course originally on Saturday rather than today on Sunday, it is now a particularly timely discussion in the light of all the latest Israeli government aggressions and atrocities that we've seen against the Palestinian people in recent weeks. And of course, although now we have a ceasefire, I'm sure that everyone on this call knows that a ceasefire is very, very far from a solution or peace in that region. For many of us active in solidarity with the Palestinian people over the years and decades, it's further confirmation of our need to stand firmly in solidarity with the Palestinian people and call out the backing of our UK government and the US and others for Israel's illegal occupations and abuses of human rights, including through arms sales. I'll just say that my own experience is that I've been to Palestine, I guess maybe 9 or 10 times. And I have to say, over the years that I've been going, I have seen those settlements increasing and increasing and increasing, which means that those people who hold to the notion of a two-state solution see that receding further and further. And I had hoped last week to have the opportunity to ask in the House of Lords a question of the relevant minister. I didn't manage to get on the list, but I can tell you that the Bishop of Southwark asked a question in the House of Lords, precisely saying, what is the UK government doing about the illegal occupation? So I think this is definitely an issue that has now got a high level of recognition in the population. But it's also very necessary in the light of Labour's front bench shift on foreign policy in recent months, away from the popular anti-war internationalism put forward from Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, that we keep up the pressure on them. So to discuss this today, we're joined by Labour and Palestine, the lifelong social and international justice campaigner, who has been the chair of Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He was a Labour Party parliamentary candidate, and he was DGS of the PCS Union. He is Hugh Lanning. Hugh will be giving us an extended contribution because he has so much experience and information to give us. And we will then go into questions and answers. We were due to be joined by Matt Wilgress, but we send our good wishes to him as he is still rather unwell. We've had in some questions, but because of the size of the audience today, I'll be reading those questions. The volunteers will be forwarding them to me, and I have already got a few. But if you want to put questions in, please do in the Q&A function. We hope to have a number of questions at the end. But without further ado, let's go straight to Hugh Lanning for our presentation from him. Hugh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone for joining us on your Sunday afternoon. Presumably all of you recovering from your being on the demonstration and getting wet yesterday afternoon. As Christine has said, the theme is why socialists should support Palestine's global campaign of resistance, and I'll try and stick to that theme and that general issue, and not cover quite so much about exactly what's happening today and going on at the moment, and maybe pick those up in questions and answers in the Q&A that follows. And I thought when saying yes to this, I thought it'd be quite easy. Oh yeah, no socialism, let's find the reasons, go to Google and get some nice good quotes, and it'd be dead easy to look it up. But actually, when you look up socialism, it's very white Western sort of definitions around economists, common ownership and so on. And actually, if you Google socialism and international, you find out about the history of the SWP or International Socialists 1, 2, 3 and 4. So in the end, I went back to basics, and this is where I'm going to try technology and share the screen and show a couple of slides to you to begin with, if it works.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant. So then I just need to scroll down. No, why is it not scrolling? There we go. So what did Karl say? Well, apart from the fact he wasn't very good on gender and race, he was a man of his time. Actually was a good quote. He says, if the emancipation of the working classes requires their fraternal concurrence, how are they to fulfill that great mission with a foreign policy in pursuit of criminal designs, playing upon national prejudices, and squandering in piratical wars, the people's blood and treasure? And essentially what he's saying is that you can't preach socialism, progressive ideas of freedom and equality at home, and then forget those principles as soon as you go abroad, that your foreign policy, what you do overseas, has got to be consistent with. And I doubt it's got to be good at the border as well, but that probably suggests another debate that we're not having today. So in following that through, I've identified what I think are 8 good reasons that I'm going to cover during the course of this, and I'll go through those. But I did just want to cover a little bit of history beforehand. I'm never quite sure when I'm talking to a Labour audience or a more general audience just how much knowledge there is. So I assume that there's a basic knowledge, and today obviously a very knowledgeable audience, but I'll try and cover some things in background. And at the end, we were just talking about it, at the end after the Q&A, I'll come back to some of those things like what you can do and how you can get involved and some of the more active stuff. But moving to just the next slide. This is one of the most, I think, effective graphical tools we have in our campaigning, the Disappearing Palestine Map, which shows the history. And I just think if people get this map, or we use it to explain it to people, then they understand really what's going on. And I won't go into all of the nuance around it, but if you look on the left-hand side, the green area, that is how Palestine was before the Second World War. And what people often, and I think it's the thing that lots of people don't know, is that in that era, it was under British occupation, it was a British mandate, it was under British rule, and we were responsible for the whole of that space. And the second map across was what the UN suggested should be done in the creation of the State of Israel, the white bits being Israel and what was left being there for Palestine, but that never happened. What you got instead in 47 and 48 was the Nakba. And if you look at the third map, that is where the armistice took place. That's the famous green line, if you like, of Gaza on the left and the West Bank of the Jordan River on the right, and the rest being what is the internationally recognized, I suppose, borders of the State of Israel. And that is the map on which really the two-state solution is based. When they talk about the 1967 borders, that's the map that they're talking about. But that was in 1967, those areas in green of the West Bank and of Gaza were then occupied by Palestine, by Israel, which now has military control over the whole of what it was historic Palestine. And the last one on the right is a bit out of date because that says up to 2016, but that shows the fragmentation of the West Bank with settlements, which Christine was referring to. It's a lot worse than that now, but also when you hear talk about annexation, it's that sort of picture, but worse than that was being talked about as making, if you like, the legitimate or illegitimate state of Israel based on annexing all those further bits in white into the state of Israel. So if you keep that picture in mind as we go through things today, I think that's probably the most useful frame of reference we got. And just the last slide I was going to do, this is a bloke called Eduardo Galeano, who's a Uruguayan left-wing writer, commentator, and so on. And he did this sort of book, which was a phrase or a comment or something for every day of the year. You know, you get those silly calendars with a thought for the day or something. Well, he did it as a book, and it was a bit more substantial for this. And this is what he wrote for the 14th of May. And I won't read it all, but essentially what he says at the end is that really what the Europeans have done is export their guilt, and that we are now making the Palestinians pay the bill for what we did as the West and as European nations for persecuting the Jews. And I just think it's always important for us to remember that whoever you want to blame and however you want to go through the history of how we got to where we are, it wasn't the Palestinians' fault, but it is them that are paying the price for what is going on. So you'll be pleased to hear that that's the end of the slides for the time being. And you go back to my face. And then what I wanted to go through then really were those sorts of reasons that I'd talked about. And as I say, there's 8. And the first, which I've touched on already, is that it's our fault. Why should we as British socialists be concerned about it? Because from Balfour, when we gave away a country that wasn't ours and said it was okay to establish a state of Israel onwards, Britain has always played a leading and culpable part. And the decisions around the colonization of Palestine were a carve up that we did with the French after the First World War, and we carved up the Ottoman Empire, and we took the bits where we were interested in the oil, sea and railway lines. And there's a really good book by James Barr called A Line in the Sand, which talks about that sort of period and area and time. But if you look at our responsibility, not only was it a British protectorate up to 47, 48, but essentially the British walked away in 48 and allowed the Nakba, the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians to take place. And I think the other reason, apart from our historical role, is that the Palestinians partly blame us. Rightly, there is a lot of anger and frustration about the historic role that Britain has played, but also look to us. And I would just say, in sort of conclusion, a lot of British colonial wars there've been wars of liberation that they've happened, although a lot of the populations are still suffering in those colonies that were British colonies. But this is a still ongoing British legacy, a colonial fight that is going on that is undecided. And we need to be clear where we stand on it. The next reason I've called it's about elimination. And I think it's important that we realize what Israel is seeking to do here. You often hear people talking about almost like there's 2 countries existing side by side, and one, the Palestinians fires rockets into Israel and they seek to defend themselves. But actually, if you look at what is really going on and you look at that map, what Israel is trying to do is create a global map which has no Palestine on it at all. Indeed, the school books they give out to Israeli schools show no Palestine, show no border for Israel. And if that global crime of eliminating the reality of Palestine takes place, it will be on our watch. And that elimination takes real practical force. It is Sheikh Jarrah, it's Salwan, it's all of the areas in East Jerusalem. It's the attacks on Al-Aqsa. It's what goes on in Hebron. It's the continual push to try and, I think as Netanyahu said it, annex as much land as they possibly can and as few Palestinians as they can. And their end game, and this is what annexation revealed, the end game was for there to be complete control from the Mediterranean Sea on the west to the River Jordan on the east, and with Israel in total control of that. And that would be, in my view, a global crime. And I think the sort of support there was on the demonstrations illustrates that to a point. But you do get critics like Jonathan Friedland in the Guardian saying, "Well, why do we keep on talking about Israel? What about China? What about other places where nasty things are going on?" And I would just, in response, apart from the other question, say, look, Israel can't have it both ways. It can't want to be part of the white Western democratic world, appear on Univision and so on, and at the same time commit international crimes, continue with the occupation, establish apartheid, and claim immunity from it. And that's why it keeps on drawing attention to itself. Hopefully moving on a bit more quickly, but the next reason I give is that Palestine is a litmus test issue. And if you look at the Labour rules, its rule book, it says we want to secure peace and freedom for everyone, everywhere. The UN Charter says we want to establish conditions of justice and respect. Mandela famously said that unless there's freedom for Palestine, there can't be freedom for anyone. And if you look at those moral issues and those high morals, I don't think we can idly stand by as socialists and say, well, we're neutral on that. If we profess those morals, then where do we stand on the Israel-Palestine issue? And I think at the moment, historically, we've been on the wrong side in that discussion. You look at the reality that the UK and most Western governments have funded Israel's military might. They funded the occupation, and then we wring our hands and say, isn't it terrible what's going on, when we've actually provided the means, the technology and the arms and the money to enable it to take place. So at the moment, I think we're on the wrong side in that debate, and we need to shift, and socialists need to be part of that. The next reason I've entitled is there's a global discourse war going on that we need to be a part of. And one of the areas where Israel recognizes it's losing is in its global public opinion, in the social media, and in some of the mainstream media. And after the assault on Gaza in 2009, it had a think tank called the Reut Institute look at how they could improve their position. And basically, they came to the conclusion that what they needed to do was delegitimize the supporters of Palestine, those who supported boycott, divestment and sanctions, and to try and win back hearts and minds. But actually, they have failed on that in so many areas. And I think the last 2 weeks demonstrations prove that. But they established a government department, a strategy department, put millions of pounds in to trying to fight that global discourse war. And I know I'll come at the end to what we can do, but actually this is a real live war that is going on across the world, in every country, in every area, talking about the rights and wrongs. And for our part, I think we just need to stick very closely to telling the story about what's happening to Palestine and what Israel's actions are. And it reminds me of my time of when I was a trade union official, and the employer and the media, when we were on strike or having a dispute, always wanted to talk about the strike action and the effect it was having. And our media lesson was, no, talk about the causes of the strike and not the effects of the strike. And we need to keep our debate around this issue in the global discourse war very much on what the causes of the problem are, and be clear in our minds that this is a live, ongoing issue at the moment. Linked to that is the global campaign of resistance that was in the title of today's message. And I talked about Israel wanting to eliminate, if you like, the reality of Palestine or political Palestine from the map. But Israel's problems is that the Palestinians aren't going anywhere, that they are still there. And if you look at that territory from the Mediterranean Sea to the River Jordan, there's about 6 to 7 million of Israeli Jews or Palestinian Arabs. The population levels are about the same. What is the case, though, is that there is a huge imbalance of power. there is a military might supported by the US, the European Union and the UK on one side. And there's talk at the moment of negotiations and people trying to say, let's get peace back on track. And I remember talking to Palestinians, they say, well, negotiations are no good while there's that imbalance of power going on. And there was a famous phrase that was used here about Churchill having to go naked into the chamber. I think it was Churchill, some British leader. Well, what we're actually asking the Palestinians to do at the moment is not just to be naked, but with their hands tied behind their back and a gun to their head to go and face a huge opposition, so that their resistance, which is just survival and amazing, and we've seen in the last months how they've kept that resistance going in the West Bank, in Gaza, and inside 47, 48 in Jerusalem and in Sheikh Jarrah, that we need to be trying to redress that balance. And the call from the Palestinian people has been consistent. It's for boycott, divestment and sanctions. It's for a non-violent global campaign and linking together the domestic resistance with the Palestinian diaspora and also solidarity. We need that to be part of a global campaign, part of the decolonisation struggle, but also we should be clear that it's not going to be international law that are going to come to the rescue here. International law is the framework within which we talk about things, but actually international law relies on the US, the UN, Israel to comply with it. And so, as we found with South Africa, actually we need sanctions. We need there to be government pressure placed on Israel to redress that balance. So no matter how much the Palestinians resist, until that balance of power is shifted in global opinion and actually in support for Israel, then there's going to be no chance. Getting towards, I suppose, the end of the main reasons that I've got. The next one is, and this is, I suppose, particularly with our audience today, that there's been a failure of the left on Palestine. If you look at it historically, unlike Cuba, Chile, South Africa, where you've got the Communist Party or the ISSWP or other organizations involved in their solidarity organizations, Palestine has never really been adopted by the left consistently over the decades. It's not one they'll come along when there's a demo, and we notice in the PSC we used to have there's a demo, which group is going to come along today, but consistent hard work on the issue of Palestine the left's been good at. And if you look at the Labour Party, actually before, during and after the Second World War, it substantially, along with the TUC most of the time, supported a Jewish national home from Balfour onwards. There's not been a good track record, and the Labour Party leaders, by and large, again, have been very supportive of Israel over the years, with one honourable exception more recently when Jeremy came and spoke on the platforms of the PSC and elsewhere. So that although there's been a theoretical anti-colonial stance on the left, very often that has not translated into practice. And so people standing up for Palestine is an important thing, and the left should be part of that. And I think within the Labour Party, Palestine ought to be seen as part of the battleground for what the, if you like, the hearts and minds of the Labour Party and a socialist perspective on it is going to be going forward. And certainly Labour and Palestine's experience has been that there is huge grassroots support for Palestine. I think that was shown in the 2018 and 2019 conferences when motions were passed, that we found from CLP meetings and so on that there's great support. A recent poll that was done showed that the overwhelming majority of Labour Party members supported boycott, divestment and sanctions, irrespective of which leader they supported in the last leadership elections for the Labour Party. It wasn't a factional issue, it was across the board that there was support for that. And I think if you look historically within the left and within the Labour Party, that grassroots support for Palestine has not been reflected at the leadership or the public and policy areas of the party. My penultimate reason is it's all a capitalist plot, that one would say, wouldn't one? But if you're looking at everything, Israel is not playing a neutral role in terms of the globalization, Western globalization, neoliberal globalization of the world. It's an outhouse for the, if you like, arms and technology and the arms trade, and plays a key role in that. But also, it's a sort of a strong Israel is an important part of the West strategy about how it deals with what it sees as the hostile Arab and non-Western nations of the world. And if you look at what Israel's role is in the global fight for a more democratic or a less unequal world, actually Israel stands predominantly in support of global inequality. It supports or challenges, doesn't support it, is not in favour of decolonization movements, and it's really part of the far right popular alliance that is seeking to, if you like, shift things globally. So I think if you are a socialist and you want to weaken or change or undermine capitalism, you can't see Israel as a neutral part of that debate and the discussion. And the last sort of reason of this bit of what I'm talking about is I've headed Black Lives Matter, and I think that's because we need to see Palestine as an anti-racist campaign. It's not just a historic or an anti-colonial campaign. Israel is a racial state. It is trying to implement all of the mechanisms of apartheid. And actually, if you look at what it's saying, it is trying to dehumanize Palestinians. How it talks about them as other people, not part of the state. It is actually a racial vocabulary that it uses to try and demean and dehumanize the Palestinians. And if you look at the apartheid controls that are being introduced consistently, be it surveillance, the laws in housing, everywhere else, they are racially based. It is treating Israeli Jews in a way so that they can be dominant and have control and power and be treated in a better way. And I think the two recent reports by Bet Salem and the Human Rights Watch, which document that in great detail, give great power to that. So that we need, I think, to try and visualize and argue and see the campaign for Palestine as part of that global Black Lives Matter decolonization campaign, and not just Palestinians as indigenous people, but other indigenous populations are also trying to fight across the globe to make a difference. So those are what I identified. I'm sure there's many other reasons that people could come up with as 8 good reasons why socialists ought to care about Palestine. As I say, I'll come back later on about when we come to a conclusion, what can be done, how you can get involved, what Palestinians ask us to do, and also what the solution is, what the outcome is. So hopefully that gives you cause for thought. Thanks for listening, and happy to answer some questions.
Hugh, that was great. Thank you very much. I'm sure that people will be thinking about that and putting in their questions. And I've certainly got some to put to you in a minute, but you can have a short rest of your voice for a moment while I just say that we had over 300 people joining the call, which I think is pretty good considering we had to make a last minute change from yesterday to today. And the volunteers on the call are telling me they're coming from Essex, Hackney, Hull, Montgomeryshire, Plymouth, Sheffield, Somerset and Worthing. So if where you are hasn't been called out, please make sure you put it up and I'll give you a shout out too. Before we come to the questions, we are just going to have a brief word from Ben Hayes to talk about Labour Outlook. And of course, as we said, this is the platform that is hosting today's event. So over to you, Ben.
Hello there. I think I may have to remain a sort of faceless voice for the time being due to the tech settings. Here we go.
There we are. We've
Thanks
got you.
very much. I've appeared. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, so my name's Ben. I'm from Islington North CLP. And I'm here just to give a brief introduction to Labour Outlook for anyone who's unfamiliar with us. So Labour Outlook was set up to provide news, views and ideas from across the Labour left. We've got regular contributions from Socialist MPs. So Bel Ribeiro-Addy and Richard Bergen have had pieces in the last few days, for example. And also updates on the trade union movement, community campaigns, international struggles, liberation issues, climate action and more. So please do feel free to check us out on the website and our Labour Facebook and Twitter pages if you haven't already. There will be shortly links in the chat if you'd like to donate to help us cover the cost of using Zoom webinar for these events. For some reason, big donors don't seem to be flocking to us yet. I can't imagine why. I think we're a great little team, if I say so myself. And we are run by volunteers. I know times are tough for a lot of people right now, but if you're able to contribute anything, all support is very much appreciated. Finally, just to give people a heads up for our next Labour Outlook forum, which is by no means unrelated to the topic of today's discussion. It's on why Socialists support United Ireland. So we'll be joined by Chris Hazard, who's the MP for Southdown, and Rachel Garnham, who many people watching this may remember and indeed have voted for as a former member of the National Executive Committee. That's coming on Saturday, the 3rd of July at 2 p.m. I think links for the registration to that will also be posted in the chat here. And we put in updates about it on our social media pages in the run up to the event. So hopefully see you at that. Thanks very much for your support and joining us today. Make sure to stay tuned in for I think will be a really good discussion. And have a lovely rest of your Sunday.
Thanks very much, Ben. And because I don't tweet myself, I abjectly failed at the beginning of this to say that you can tweet throughout this event at Labour Outlook @Labour Outlook, all one word. So feel free to start tweeting away if you're a Twitter person. So we're going to come to some questions. Some of them cover some of the area that oh God, right, before we go to the questions, just in case I lose this, here are more people who said they're listening. Cambridgeshire, Dundee, Essex, we've already had Essex. Galway, welcome from Ireland. Hastings, Keighley, Leicester, Norwich, Penarth, and Stockport. So great, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions now to Hugh, and here's one that I think you have covered this to some extent, Hugh, but it is something that you hear sometimes, even from people on the left, which is that they say that they're reluctant to stand up for Palestine because they're told it's very complicated and it's an intractable situation. So what do we say to those people? How do we get through to them in terms of the simplest way of explaining the occupation and the illegality of the occupation? And you can come back to this right at the end, but people are also asking what they might read in order to be able to understand that. And then a kind of second question is the Israeli attack on the building in Gaza, which has Al Jazeera, Associated Press and the BBC, shows that the Israelis are willing to target civil society and media. What are the best sources of information on what happens in Gaza and the West Bank and in Israel? I mean, I should say the Israelis are also prepared to attack clinics and schools and everything else. But this is a question specifically about the media. So if you want to have a go at those two, I've got a couple more coming up. So don't feel you've got to give very long answers to those.
Okay. Is that a hint?
No, not at all. We've got plenty of time.
Okay. On the first question, this question of it's complicated. I think it needs to be understood that is part of the strategy of Israel's strategy, is to describe it as a complicated historical, religious conflict, their security, all of those sorts of issues that you hear flung at it. And I think the map that I showed, I think is actually a very simple issue. If you stick to the framework of equality, international law and human rights, you don't need to go into history or background of where it's come. The occupation, which I described, that took place in 1967, is the longest running military occupation that is still going. Is clear under international law that that's illegal. And although there are military occupations that take place during wars and conflicts, they're meant to be temporary. They're not meant to last like this has from over 50 years from 1967. And linked to that is the issue of settlements, which I mentioned briefly. What international law says is that the occupying power is not allowed to resettle its own population into the area that it's occupied, because that is saying this isn't a temporary occupation. We're planning to colonize and take over this land permanently. And so I think in explaining the basics, it's not about religion, it's about the land, and it's about Israel trying to dispossess the Palestinians of their land, and it's doing it illegally. It's doing it by occupation. And the easiest thing and the most clear demand, I think, in terms of saying is Israel needs to end the occupation. That is, if you like, the key point. There's international and global agreement. I think it's only Israel globally that recognises that occupation is not illegal. There are loads of books that you can read, lots on the history and so on. I've got on my last point I was going to make, one I was going to recommend, I'll do it again, but it's one by Rashid Khalidi, which is the 100 Years War on Palestine. And it's a good blend of both the politics, the history, and also what he describes as the settler colonialist conquest and also the Palestinian resistance. And he talks about the 6 declarations of war there have been on Palestine since 1917 until now. But I'll give you those details again. But if you wanted one book on which to bring together a lot of that stuff, that would be the one that I'd recommend. In terms of the attacks and latest information, it's something you have to be careful about in terms of your sources of information that you use. I know when I was at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, we were very careful to try and ensure that we use reliable sources for social media. And those reliable sources are not the mainstream media. If you look at the BBC and others at times of crisis, they will often be treating the Israeli press releases as the source of information which they put out. So actually, if you go to and look on the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, their Twitter and Facebook will often be good in terms of what the current information. There's Middle East Monitor and other reliable sites. And again, I could make available some of those, Electronic Intifada and so on, where you can get good information about what's going on, where there's some verification that's taken place. What we found in the 2014 and 2909 conflicts was that actually what was coming out on the mainstream media wasn't reflecting what was happening in reality in terms of the numbers of deaths and injuries. But there are quite well established good sources that you can now go to on social media where you can get up-to-date information about what's going on, and we can put those out and make those available to you if that would be helpful.
Yep, I think that would be really helpful. I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions, if that's okay. One of the questions says, a common media myth is that all Arab governments are pro-Palestine, pro-Palestinian. But in reality, a lot of them are actually pro-US and have abandoned a kind of pro-Palestinian position. Now, this is probably a bit beyond your remit, but the question is, what more could these regimes really do if they wanted to facilitate Palestinian statehood?
Partly there is a myth that it's only a recent phenomena that Arab governments have been supportive of Israel. You take the UAE, they've had long trading links and been supportive for a long time. I think, the one political point I would make, and I think you saw it in the last couple of weeks, and I saw it when I was in Egypt and elsewhere, the peoples of those countries are incredibly supportive of Palestine. The regimes and the governments might not be, but if you looked at the Arab Spring, if you look at the protests that went on recently, and actually there's a good reason for that. I mean, it's not the only reason, but in the countries, which I've not really referred to the refugees, but if you look at Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, there are large numbers of Palestinian refugees in those countries who have links and are supported and so on. If there's one thing that they could do, they could stop funding Israel and sanctions. I mean, there is trade that the Arab nations have and that they facilitate and they make available that could have huge power in relation to Israel. I mean, the amount of trade there is, be it through fuel, goods, technology, all those sorts of things, there is plenty of, there's plenty of scope for Arab governments as Western governments to bring pressure to bear on Israel. I mean, unfortunately, they tend to do the reverse, which is fund, and particularly through arms and other technologies. But there is plenty of scope, and I think they need to listen to their people. If they listen to their people, they would get clear advice on what they want to be done. Unfortunately, I don't think many of them listen to their people on domestic issues, let alone foreign ones.
Hugh, thank you very much. I've got another couple of questions I'm going to roll in together for you. One is, if the US can continue to frustrate UN resolutions, what are the effective sanctions that at least we could demand from the UK government? But then I'm going to put this together with another question that's come in, which is, are there opposition forces within the Israeli Jewish population who oppose the occupation? And is there any way that we can effectively link up with them? So what can we demand of our government? What could, the people of goodwill and progressive politics in the US demand of their government, presumably? But in particular, with whom can we build alliances in the Israeli Jewish population who themselves opposed the occupation?
I mean, the UK is a key trading partner with Israel on arms. I mean, apart from the fact that those arms are being used as we speak for the control and domination occupation of Palestine, it's not just that we supply the technology, we buy a lot of arms from Israel. We fund the military economy of Israel, so that the biggest single area that the UK government could do things on would be through the arms trade. But linked to that, we talked about the settlements. That costs money, and that money is funded through international, European and other banks. So if the government was to take a policy that it was going to comply with international law and make sure that there was no goods, no finance, no trade with the settlements, that would have a big impact, particularly the finance and the funding through the banks. Obviously, we're not in the EU anymore, but the EU is a key trading partner, particularly for agricultural and other produce. But the EU and the UK, we fund the occupation. Under international law, it should be the occupying power that has responsibility for the health and the well-being and the welfare of the people it's occupied. We saw recently on COVID that Israel ignored that obligation and refused to make vaccinations available to the Palestinian people. But actually, all the time that the US is essentially funding the military and the EU is funding the occupation, Israel is not having to bear the costs of its actions, so that those funding tools are there. And indeed, historically, the only time that Israel has come to the negotiating table was famously when Jimmy Carter threatened the funding on military arms, and they did come and talk. Didn't result in a good outcome, but it proves there is a means and it can be done. On the second part of the question, in Israel, I mean, it's depressing the sort of strength of the peace movement that there used to be inside Israel is less than it was, and the growth of the far right and, if you like, the mainstreaming of right-wing attitudes is growing. I mean, at the moment, even discussion about Nakba 2, that it's a legitimate thing to be thinking to try and expel another whole load of Palestinians. But there's groups like Breaking the Silence, which is former members of the Israeli army, defense forces, who disliked what they did and have been publicizing and working with PSC. We visited and talked with them and others. There's Bet Salem, who are an Israeli human rights group. There's Kavlaved. So there's quite a number of NGOs that exist, and there are brave individuals, and there are some academics. So it's not that there are none, but it's not as strong. I think what's more promising, and the last point I'll make on this, is that if you look to the United States, which has been the bastion of support, but there's a organisation doing great work, which is Jewish Voice for Peace within, and you can see that there are growing questions in the US Jewish community about them having unadulterated support for Israel and whatever it does, and particularly in the younger generations, saying they question that should be the approach of the Jewish community in the US. And that's been reflected a bit as well in the Democratic Party in the States, where partly as a consequence of Black Lives Matter, there's growing support, public support for Palestine within the Democratic Party. So I don't think we should write off the US, but I think there is proof that there's a growing debate. I mean, unfortunately, within Israel, actually, I think the trend is more to the right than it is back towards peace.
Thanks very much for that, Hugh. There's a question about, in a sense, is this a turning point for the Palestinians as they unite? Because, of course, the Palestinian population is hugely fragmented geographically, and in terms of its, the kind of life that it lives, the Palestinian population, whether they're in the West Bank, whether you're in East Jerusalem, whether you're in Gaza, whether you're in, what might be called Israel. There's a sense of, do we now see Palestinians more coming together? Has what's happened, because it's happened in Palestine 48, Gaza and the West Bank, in terms of responses to Israel? Is this a turning point, is a question from one of the people on the call.
Listening to the Palestinians, they are hoping it is, and they think there is an opportunity for it to be. It's been recognised, I think, by all the Palestinian factions that there needs to be greater unity, but the physical reality of the occupation makes that difficult to do and take forward. But I do think it was significant in the last sort of period, as you said, Christine, that it wasn't just us campaigning about stopping a bombardment of Gaza. Actually, the kicking off points were about in East Jerusalem, which Israel has already annexed. So the ethnic cleansing going on in Sheikh Jarrah, and also in Silwan and other areas of East Jerusalem. The attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and how that was defended. That's been being done in a non-factional, cross-factional way. A lot of young people involved in that, defending their religious sites and defending their communities. And I think the thing that shook Israel, because if you look at the last intifadas, most of the Palestinians within, if you like, internationally recognized Israel were passive during those periods. The demonstrations and the support and the solidarity that took place within Israel, I think, means that you got actually sort of Palestinians on all fronts working and campaigning together, and that came through with the call for a general strike earlier this week that did get cross-factional support, again, inside Israel and outside. So I think there is, based on this, a real hope. It's in difficult circumstances. I know that Israel and others say, why hasn't there been elections of the Palestinian Authority, whilst they try and stop the voting taking place? But also, those of you involved in democratic organisations, if you can think of the circumstances in which they're trying to organise elections, it's difficult. But I think they've learned the lesson that actually acting together is good. And I think there is a lot going on about people trying to make sure that's the way they go forward. And I think the other last point I'd make on this is that having seen that, I think it's sort of changing some of the international debate. It's like you said earlier on, Christine, it's not just about ceasefire. I think it's brought back to people's minds that actually there is an underlying issue and problem here that's not being tackled. And I think you can see it with all of the politicians who said ceasefire and let's get back to peace. I mean, what none of them are saying is, one, how they're going to make Israel come back to talk, and two, what a solution might look like. Just saying we don't like what's going on is no longer enough. So that I think with the support of solidarity movements, again, hopefully we can change the political debate from outside to make, let's look for a lasting solution rather than a temporary halt.
Yeah, I think that's, I certainly agree with everything you said there, Hugh. I mean, I think the fact that there is now much more talk about the occupation means that there are now more people talking about the fact that the underlying causes, so the occupation is the enormous one, simply have to be addressed if we are ever going to achieve peace. Because, you know, Gaza has been bombed and blitzed and rebuilt, and bombed and blitzed and rebuilt, and hundreds of people particularly, and children have lost their lives. But it just happens again. It just happens again until we get a solution that is a fair and just solution.
I mean, one point I forgot to mention, which you just reminded me of, and you'll know, Christine, from your own visits to Palestine, is, yes, I mean, the Palestinians are split because of the wall, because of the imprisonment of Gaza. But I think it's easy to forget that, I mean, it's a small country. It's only about 50 miles from Gaza City to Jerusalem. It's not a long way. And because of the refugees, you know, there's a lot of the 48 refugees in the West Bank. They have families inside Israel. The refugees in Gaza, the million refugees in Gaza, they have families, and they all have families in East Bank, in the West Bank, and so on. So that they aren't separate. There are family, extended family, and other links. They know of, there's connections between those areas. And I think the Western press is wrong when it talks about Gaza as if it's another country from the West Bank, whereas actually there are lots of real relationships and contact and so on that goes between all of those areas. And that's been what's good about what happened recently. I think that's been reinforced. But
I think you're right, Hugh, and I've certainly heard Palestinians themselves, not the least being Hassan Zumlot, the ambassador, make exactly that point, that actually we are all Palestinians and have extended family or close family in all parts of that region where Palestinians live. I'm going to take this one more question, and this is specifically about how is Gaza blockaded, and how, for that matter, is the West Bank hemmed in terms of the material impact of the blockade on Gaza. What is the effect on Palestinian jobs, income, health provision, access to food, and how can we demonstrate to people whose opinions, you know, we want to change or firm up, that these are clearly abuses of Palestinian human rights, and what are the best ways to show this?
I mean, Gaza, it's not understood really just how small it is. It's about the size of Sheffield, if you look at it, and it's got 2 million people in it, 1 million of them refugees. So it's one of the most crowded places. How is it controlled? Every single entry point is controlled. So there is a land security border that goes around, which has got Israeli armed forces on it. The sea is patrolled by Israeli forces. The air is controlled by Israeli Air Force, and drones and other security mechanisms. It's one of the most heavily surveyed areas, or probably the most heavily surveyed area on the world. So there is literally nothing that can go in or out of Gaza without Israel saying so. There's only really one main checkpoint from Israel into Gaza and one from Egypt into Gaza. And there's OCHA, which is the UN body that looks at the occupied territories and what the effect is. It monitors what's allowed to go through and go out. So that if you take the health service, I remember when I went to the hospital in Gaza, when I was able to get in, there was a list of about 240 prescribed medicines that the health service weren't allowed to have because those medicines could be used in circumstances of war and might save lives. That was the excuse that was being used. And during COVID, I mean, again, I remember going to hospital in Gaza where there's a few intensive care units which they have to have on backup because the electricity might go and they might not be able to run them continuously. But it was only half a dozen for the whole of Gaza. So if you think what they are trying to do in those circumstances, if you take water, water, it's cleansing and desalination constantly gets bombed. It's electricity. So all of those normal things that we take for granted, so just are decimated and not under their own control to be able to do. And that's reflected in the level of unemployment. It has one of the highest levels of unemployment certainly in the Western world, broadly speaking, and there are no jobs. They're not able to export or import or do things, so that it is, and it was Cameron who described it as the largest open air prison in the world. It is literally that, and they're not able to travel out, not able really to safely travel within, so that you can take any aspect. I mean, what amazes me, and as I say, I was lucky enough to go there, is how they continue to survive, what their ingenuity is. I mean, the UN said by 2020, Gaza will be unfit to live and operate, and still they do. And I think that is a testament to their resistance about how they carry on being able to do things. What can be done about it? Well, you know, they could lift the siege. I mean, it's straight. I mean, it's illegal. What they are doing is punishing the general population and using that as a weapon to try and bring about their means. And there's been talk about relaxation or things being done on the siege, but actually, Israel really controls a stranglehold still. So I think you come back to the same BDS. I mean, I know there's been talks in the past about can you send things, do things, get there. I went on a convoy, other people tried flotillas. There's signs of solidarity, but effectively, in terms of getting big amounts of goods and so on, that's not going to be able to be done. And really, the only way aid gets there at the moment, which has been restored through the US, is through UNRWA, which is the UN aid body, which provides, funded by the West, if you like, enough to keep people alive so that they're not dying of starvation, but not enough really to grow. But that's the only real mechanism by which, if you like, food and goods gets in to Gaza. So lift the siege is the simple, doable thing.
Okay, I've got a kind of final question for you, which I'm gonna put to you now. But then before you come back on that and make your concluding remarks, I've got a few kind of wrapping up things to say. But the question, and this is a huge question because this is Labour outlook. We're looking at the Labour Party as well as looking at Palestine, and the straightforward question is: how do we get the Parliamentary Labour Party to reject their support for Israel and to show, you know, and it doesn't say this in the question that's been sent in, but actually to be absolutely uncompromising in support for Palestinians? But come back on that. I'll just say though, in kind of beginning to answer that question before you come in, Hugh, to say that yesterday there was a meeting of the Socialist Education Association. I wasn't at it because I was doing something else. So I'm sure everybody on this call knows that the Socialist Education Association is an affiliated society to the Labour Party. And it, the clue is in the name. It's about education. And it passed a motion about Palestine, about the need to support Palestine. I mean, it erred on the side, needless to say, of education, of the fact that so many education facilities have been wiped out. And, we would think, those of us who are educationalists and people of good faith and socialists would think that schools should be places of safety. Nonetheless, they've been bombed. So there are ways, I just offer you this as a kind of lead in when you come back, Hugh. There are obviously ways that constituent parts of the Labour Party can begin to make sure that sufficient pressure is put on the Parliamentary Labour Party and the leadership of the party to make sure that they're actually, that they stand with the policy that was agreed at conference previously, and that advances in terms of supporting the Palestinians. But anyway, just before, so I can give the last word to Hugh. I'm just going to thank everybody very much for their participation this afternoon, and particularly big thanks to Hugh, because I think that really was a tour de force to be a single speaker, particularly on Zoom. It's really hard to speak to 300 people without actually being able to see them or feel how it's going in the room. If you possibly can make a donation to Labour Outlook, please do, so that we can put on more of these things. I repeat what Ben said earlier, that the next discussion is going to be why Socialists support a united Ireland, and that's on July the 3rd. Please do join in with Labour Outlook on Twitter and on Facebook to keep up to date with what's going on. And in particular, in terms of today's meeting, please support the work of both Labour and Palestine, of which Hugh is the face and the great proponent, and also make sure that you support the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and that individually and collectively we are part of the international solidarity movement for the Palestinian people. So Hugh, I've left you a few minutes to come back on that question about what we can do about our own party and our own party's leadership, and just any other concluding remarks, in particular, other things that people can do to make sure that they really are engaged on this really critical international question. Hugh.
So much as we knew what I was going to say at the end anyway, Christy. But it sort of feeds in really well. But just before, if you like, what is to be done and answering that bit about the Parliamentary Labour Party, I think it's important we understand what the Palestinians ask for us to do. And they don't ask for us to go there and lecture them about how to resist or what the solution should be. They ask, what are you doing in your country? And what do they ask us to do? They ask us to tell their story. They don't want anything else. They want us, where we live, where we work, where we do things, to have the confidence and to tell their story. Because they believe if the world knew what the story was, then there would be sufficient pressure, if you like, to make a difference. And we have a great tendency, and I'm back as a student, and I get fed up with American and European academics who lecture the Palestinians about what they should do, and you get lots of people saying, should it be a 1-2 or a 2-state solution? And I say, well, it's up for the Palestinians to decide what they should do. It's their outcome, and they're often an excuse for not doing anything, actually, and coming back, what is to be done in the Parliamentary Party, and more generally, it is to talk about Palestine. And I was going to mention, as Christine just has, if you're keen to get involved as an activist on the issue, there's the PSC, there's the Solidarity Movement, there's a range of organisations who are active, like the demonstrations and so on, when you can be proactively involved. And I wouldn't underestimate that you as an individual, it's quite interesting, our pub across the road is open, and I'd been on the demonstration yesterday, just talking in the pub, talking to friends, talking to family, raising it as an issue is something that people underestimate. It's like, raising, if a racist joke is told, you ought to do something about it. Well, you get opportunities to talk about Palestine, let's do it. But in the Labour Party, and how can we get the PLP to change? The reason why Labour and Palestine was set up, because a number of us took the view was that there was huge support for Palestine within the Labour Party that just wasn't being reflected. And I think that was shown at the two conferences where there was the flag waving of the Palestinian flag and so on, when the motions were passed. Despite a lot of undercover wheeling and dealing to try and stop the motions being talked about, or what the motion should say, or to stop flags going into the hall and so on, that came through, that there is that sort of support there. So within it, I think constituency Labour parties are the focus where we need to do as much as we can. Because I think the pressure would be on the PLP if all of the MPs were going back to their constituencies and they were getting resolutions were being passed, debates were taking place on Palestine, they were seeing what the reality is in terms of support for Palestine. And the Labour in Palestine we're about to put around, or has gone out to those on our database, a model motion for conference. But even it's just to raise the issue of Palestine. And I think it's important, there's been all of the discussion, I've deliberately not talked a lot about anti-Semitism and so on, is that we need to keep the conversation about Palestine, raising what is going on, what the parliamentary party and what the leadership is going to do on Palestine, because it's not been loud and shouting, it's not been at the forefront of saying things. And actually, if we want a democratic socialist Labour Party, it ought to be on the forefront of the issue of what we can do. So making sure there's a debate in your own CLP, and we can provide online speakers if they're online and so on. Looking at the conference motion or just having a motion put forward. If you're involved in affiliated organisations, you were talking about the Socialist Education Association. There are the youth organisations, women's parts of the Labour Party, BAME, all sorts of affiliated areas within the Labour movement generally. There's the whole trade union movement, which at a national level has got good policy, and a lot of the unions individually have. But having it, there's a large number of the unions that are affiliated to the Labour Party, a lot of the branches and people are members. So raising the debate inside trade union branches in the same way as the CLP will have a consequential effect. Because I think what we want to try and do within the PLP is get it acknowledged and accepted and felt that actually support for Palestine is the norm, is where we should be, that we should be on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor, and there's one place for us to be. And as I said, the good book that I could give you was the Rashid Khalidi, Khalidi, the 100 Years War on Palestine, if you look that up on Google and so on. But I was just going to do one quote from him, because he talks about the history, and he is Palestinian, obviously, and he comes back to what the solution should be. And I think this is helpful, I think, in the discussion about where the PLP should be. He says, there are now two peoples in Palestine, irrespective of how they came into being, and the conflict between them cannot be resolved as long as the national existence of each is denied by the other. Their mutual acceptance can only be based on complete equality of rights, including national rights, notwithstanding the historical differences between the two. There is no other possible sustainable solution, barring the unthinkable notion of one people's extermination or the expulsion by the other. And I think it's a very level-headed way in which he says we have to look further down the path. No one is talking about the extermination or expulsion of the Israelis from the territory, nor should that be the case of the Palestinians. And trying to enable a solution to come out of that is where the PLP should be. And rather than us just saying it's terrible and we believe in a two-state solution and we're going to allow Israel to carry on breaking international law, we need to get the PLP to the point where not only does it side with Palestine, it accepts that if Israel continues to break international law, there must be consequences for their actions, and that we need to be in opposition and in government advocating that there needs to be sanctions, there need to be actions taken. And it's what the BDS movement, the Palestinians themselves call for. Their call for boycott, divestment and sanctions is not indefinite. It is until Israel complies with international law. And I think that is a framing that the Labour Party should be comfortable with adopting, and that there are friends of Israel within the Labour Party, but they ought to be sending that message back to Israel as well, that what you're currently doing isn't an acceptable behaviour. And Israel likes to claim that it's a democracy, it's one of the Western democracies, but you can't be a democracy in part of the country that you control or part of the world that you control, whilst you're excluding, occupying, shooting and killing the other bit. The Palestinians have no votes and have no say, and Israel is not a democracy whilst the occupation continues. So I think the last point I would say is that speaking up, we should not underestimate speaking up as an individual, as a person in your world for Palestine, what difference that will make. And the more people we can get doing that within the Labour Party, I think the more we can get the silent majority to be the vocal ascendancy, if you like, within the party, which is where we should be.
Hugh, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. And I just conclude by saying amplifying the voice of the Palestinians is absolutely what we must be doing. And if you don't remember to quote Hugh Lanning, all of you on this call, you can remember to quote the Bishop of Southwark. If he is going around saying we must address the illegal occupation, Israel's illegal occupation, then I think you can believe that you're standing on the side of right with Hugh Lanning and the Bishop of Southwark. So thanks very much for joining us today. We're now going to sign off, but make sure that you sign up to Labour Outlook, that you support the Palestinians through the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Labour for Palestine. Enjoy the rest of your day. Solidarity.
Thank you, Christine. Great stuff. Thank you very much.